As we go through these slides in this PowerPoint of the different designs, I just want you to take note of the style of the work that's there, the color palette that's used, and the detail. Sometimes they're very simple, and other times there is a lot of information, like in this one. Basically, the fact that I have a 24 by 36 inch or A1 piece of paper, but I want to fill with as much information as possible because in many cases this is the only piece that will be shown. And although there is a lot of documentation that goes with this, reports, data tables, plant lists, things like that, this is a nice graphic that can be printed and hung up and people can stare at for a while. And in this case, in Haiti, there was a lot of detail here and a lot of work to be done for this village. And so I just wanted to fill up all these spaces with different information. And it also is a point for discussion when it's presented or as it's being found, hung up on the wall, hopefully. And so there's a lot of detail in this. Now, this is the full Adobe Illustrator PDF. But then, as you know, we would have artboards with different sections selected off so that when you did a PDF, you would have magnifications of different areas in the PDF that you could use for your report. So even though we have this one picture, which is basically artboard 1, you could also have another dozen artboards that would show up on separate pages in the PDF to be printed or to be sent out to somebody, which gives you a much closer view, like the polycultures in here. Each one of those could be a separate artboard and a separate page with more text explaining that. Or the basins and the swales and the berms and other areas where you have detail, that could be a whole another 8.5 by 11 page that is output into the PDF. So this is how I like to work, and although this is from 2017, it's a while back, it still works, and I like to use it because of the detail, the color, and how much information you can pack into one of these. And especially since it's kind of a different sort of shape, it lends itself, we should say, to a lot of other opportunities to show information on the design. This is another example, and in this case, in Senegal, we have two maps. One is the original, basically, base map on the left, and then as we're progressively going through to the final design on the far right. Now, the other two on the left was working remotely, not a lot of information, not a lot of great aerial imagery or anything like that. And the last one was done from the drone work that we did on site in Senegal. And then you can see also that they're totally different, all of them. The first two are kind of similar, not knowing and understanding the culture, what's going on there and what they're growing, or the systems that already existed. And then once getting there, actually on the far right, ending up with augmenting their existing system, expanding their production areas, but also adding in a lot of the features for windbreaks, fencing, things like that. And so a lot of that detail. So the fact that the map, you might say, isn't correct in the beginning, it's a conversation. And that's more what I'm looking at when I'm working with these maps is we print them out or we get on Zoom and we have conversations with people and we talk about things. Even with the base map, just looking and explaining these are the things I see, other things that are missing, they can tell us about, or you get your base map printed out, you bring it with you on any site and do your notations on that paper printout. A black and white blueprint, they call them sometimes at different printers, can be as little as $5. And you have a black and white 24 by 36 piece of paper and you could take with you and just get the crayons out. Get 2 or 3 made, one for the client. And that's where you put your notes and make your corrections and then go back, of course, to Illustrator and be working. In this design in Costa Rica, you can see also this is an older style, lots of saturated colors, and in this case, actually the road and the river obscures the plants. This is a good example of how you want to keep a consistent density and colors for your design so that certain things don't overshadow and obscure other things. So like here, what we would do now is the stream beds and the ponds and the roads which pop off of here, we would screen those back a lot more. You don't need that saturated color. And the plants then would pop forward in there. So in a sense, and you also can tell there's no aerial picture in the background of this because that would even make it more difficult to see, although we might screen it back quite a bit just to have a little texture back there. But this is an example where things are kind of fighting with each other. So the road needs to be screened back quite a bit. The stream beds, the ponds, and then that will move the plants up and forward and make it easier to see. It's not like you're having to look through, iron bars to find the detail of what you're looking for in this design. Then because of the shape of the land also, we have the polycultures on the right, boxes of information on the left, and again, kind of bringing a lot more information in this. What you don't see on here is the sector map, the sun angles, and things like that. Those are things now that we add on the title block to most all of our designs. This project in Spain, in the Altiplano for the ecosystem restoration camps, cooperative, and I think it's called community. This was done there, one of my first projects for them. Actually, I think it was the only project I worked on with them, working from aerials from Google Earth. Later on, I think they had some drone work and made a couple trips there. First of all, for doing the initial base map for this project, and then doing the final design. And a lot of what they've done is kind of based on this. The road and the swales were things that I cut in when I was there with the equipment that we had, and then they've done other work since then. The growing beds, the big green areas, those I think have been replaced again with more trees and more crops, but generally speaking, of course, they followed the contours in this area. Once again, very basic colors and saturation in here, and probably could have had a little bit more art to it, you might say, instead of just being so plain. But this also had different blown up areas. You can see call outs in the lower right and the bottom. These are also then output in the PDF in multiple pages for later discussion. But pretty simple, pretty straightforward design, kind of giving the idea of the patterns and the strategies of planting in this area. This was a major project in Canton, Ohio, again, some years ago. And again, you can see the colors, a little bit of saturated. We're kind of moving forward and not too bad. Mostly this was about installation, and most of this was installed on this property. What you're not seeing here is in that gray area wrapped by trees, there's like this little gray, almost like a comma, was a large underground dome, a concrete dome sprayed there, and that was going to be their new house. So there was a lot of construction here, but they also wanted to do a lot of food production. Originally, they had buffalo on this land, and when that went away, then they wanted to put more plants in, more production. We actually found 16 Korean nut pines on sale at a nursery, which was amazing, and bought these. They were like 16, 18 feet tall Korean nut pine trees, and so we sent a flatbed truck to pick all of those up. And I think the last I heard that maybe 2 of those died soon after the installation, within a few years, but the rest were actually going fine. And having Korean nut pine at all is an amazing plant to have for harvesting and having that protein and also the oil that comes with it. But you can see in this case, we have taken the symbol library and cut and paste that, basically copied it off of Illustrator and pasted it into the design. They're not great resolution, but they do work for identification. But also you can see that most of the plants here in the old style were numbered. The existing plants just had, the dot in the middle, and then the new plants had numbers on them with correlated to over into the symbol library. Now we're using the scientific name and initials for our plants. We don't number them anymore. They just got to be too much work with that. But you'll also see in the upper right all the call-outs, all the different plant communities, the different polycultures. Those are in files. Those have been used on other projects, and that's the nice thing about working with Illustrator is every time you create a plant system, you put it in your library. And even though some of the species may change, the structure of that polyculture can be duplicated anywhere. It's just a matter of the species of the plant and maybe the spacing. But once it's in your symbol library, you can always open it up, break the link, and edit it and make a new one. Adding more plants, getting rid of others, it just saves you a lot of time. So on this one, you can see on the right side, a lot of call-outs, soil maps, and the key, things like that. All these formats are very changeable, even having a little divot in the title block in the bottom to take in that corner and get the property to fit more into the space. All good. Nothing is really sacred in here, but it does need to look balanced, and it needs to have enough information to keep somebody's interest. This is a project I worked on with Mike Hagwood out in Maryland. Actually, where I am right now recording this is on another project site that he has in Colorado. And this is a 100-acre farm in Ellicott City, Maryland. And the owner had bought this farm and wanted to basically bring his family onto this farm and create their life space, you might say, with it. So there are a lot of systems on here, and even after we did the installation on here, which Mike was in there for like the next year, all the ponds, all the trees, all the swales, berms, all the work that we did in the design were installed. The only thing that wasn't installed was on the far left. There was a little store, farm store, things like that, that was put off. But you can see all the documentation on the right, all the plant lists. And since there were animals and there were pasture management and field management, a lot of that information on the upper left. So this is another case where we have an odd shape. I want it to fit. Generally speaking, I like the north arrow to go up, but sometimes it fits better if it's a different direction. But what's more important, I really want to say about this, is the aspect and how we see the design on our paper or on our screen should be how the client addresses it. It's like when they drive into the property and that's how they see it, that should be the bottom of the map. If that's from the east or the west or whatever, just so that their orientation is important and how they see the land makes it easier for them to understand. So sometimes the north arrow faces up most of the time, but other times not. However, it just fits the design. We also have, of course, a vertical title block for vertical, more vertical, rectangular, or other types of property sizes, and that's fine too. So whatever fits. But what I like about this, like the other ones that you've seen, is that you can get a lot of data on here. Really go to it with the graphic design, lists, plant lists, symbols, plant symbols, all those kinds of things that you might have seen in other designs too, and charts, but also listing out strategies and things like that. So what it is, it's a very big design, and this is what's difference between ours and, say, engineering designs. We can fill this page with a lot of detail. And then, of course, being careful, again, with the saturation of the colors, like we see with the ponds and things like that. We want to be careful with how things are represented because they can fight with each other, and it actually adds fatigue to the eyes, as we call it, visual noise. But I like this one, and it's a good explanation of how to get a lot of information on here, and you want people to keep looking at it, especially with the design. And also there could be some call-outs. In this case, we use number circles, which correlated to the report or other things that are on here in lists. That also was helping out for people to understand what's going on in those areas. So in the zones 1 through, I think it's 11 on here, but there's also, for our reports, each of these areas then had a narrative that went with it for the plans and what might be working in that area going forward. This was a long time ago, and as you can tell, right, this was an intentional community in Texas, and went down there with 2 other designers that hired me, and one of the designers hired me to go there. And so I was basically the illustrator. I was help planning this, also bringing some sense of polycultures and different work for this. But there was a lot going on in this intentional community and a lot of preferences for that. And we got into the home concept, the different ideas for how they wanted to have their community there, the fact that they wanted to have 22 homes, and we were saying, how about 3 to start and then add 10 more, spacing them out. So a lot of times we're actually having to work through the process with people and pop a few balloons, and really kind of moderate their expectations based on what we have in this area. And especially here where it was kind of a forested area, but even just in the construction of the roads and the buildings and everything, most of this is just going to get leveled. It's very difficult to have this kind of development with all the infrastructure and the utilities without a lot of disturbance and losing a lot of the trees there too. The 2-acre lake with an 8-foot depth that was put in, not very likely to happen there, maybe about a 2-acre mud hole. But then also, one of the interesting things about that, it wasn't the digging of that, but where do you put that soil and the actual movement of 25,000 cubic yards of soil off onto the property in other areas. And that's why the home concept were bermed homes, soil covered homes. So building the homes, concrete, covering them up for cooling because it is Texas, in this area. But once again, you can see in this area the saturated colors. Once again, old style, but a lot of detail in here, and then the call outs along with other information that was handed off for this. So this was one of my original designs in 2011, for one of the first projects that I was doing when I was being hired by other designers. Here's another simple design. This is a homestead residential space, Minnetonka, Minnesota. Notice what we have on here are contour lines. We have the existing trees on here and a few other planted trees. And most of the work that we were doing, this is just the initial concept stage on this design. Not a lot going in here except trying to get the existing trees. And as again, what you can see is the aerial picture was turned off. A lot of times it's because it's not good quality. I didn't use a drone. I was using off of Google Earth or something like that. But for them, it actually works because the house is there, the driveway, the roads, they're oriented how they see the property, which is just fine. All the trees are there, and it actually makes up for then discussion, for a lot of discussion what we're having with this, with the owner here. What you also kind of see is that the property line going around it gets cut off on the left. There's a little box there. That's where some text was going. But overall, this is like the first concept that I was going to the client with saying, we're thinking about something like this. And mostly it was that green area, terracing area, and a fenced off garden with raised beds was basically all we were asked to do. But I always recommend with people, if you're doing the base map, do the entire property. If they're saying, well, we're only going to do the backyard, well, that's for other conventional landscapers. We always base map the entire thing, then we can zoom in to the backyard. It also gives them a map of their entire property, which they will appreciate. But also, it also might move us into other sections of the property as they get excited about the work and other things are happening as you're walking around. You might have an idea of other things you can do, like in this case, water collection, some issues that they had with runoff, water, things like that, and also adding other trees in their property for privacy or just because of the health of their canopy, talking about different trees and the treatment thereof with those spaces. So again, very simple here. It doesn't have to be complex. And we were just focusing on that upper garden area. Now back on the East Coast in Virginia, this was, you can see now we're starting getting into the newer style of designs. One of the things that came up from this, and you can see it in the upper right, there's this ghosting of circles and things like that. And I don't remember what the problem was with having those show up. I'm sure it's something that could go away, but I think it has something to do with the symbols on here. And that was interfering with the design itself as it was printed. In this case, with this PDF for this slide that I created, those things might have gone away. So this is the area that used to be a horse ranch, and they wanted to convert it into more trees. And so you can see all the patch dynamics that we have of adding trees in little areas, orchard spaces, things like that. There's a mandala garden over by the barn where the horses are kept, around the house, lots of terracing, things like that, and also working around existing buildings there for the possibilities of greenhouses and things like that. So again, now in this case, you can see that the aerial is in there, and it's screened back because there are little things, little elements that you can see ghosted in. But now with the trees on top and the design on top, it actually, those elements and that phases of colors that come and go kind of help create the texture and the context of where this is being built. One of the other things we get into, of course, when we're working with Illustrator is making charts. We explain things to people. And I think this is a great way of doing that when just thinking of how you're trying to explain. In this case, it was community design and how is our process going to work. And I think originally this was done for the project in Haiti because there was a lot of people involved in that. Us, we being in the center as the project designers, working with the local experts, you know, basically the core group of people in the community, and then letting them talk to the more diverse community outside the center circle, you might say, of decision makers. So we would get the information coming in, public participation, all that kind of information coming in through our liaisons. We try to keep it to a minimum. We don't want to talk to 30 people. We want to talk to 2 or 3 in meetings about what's going on, and their responsibility is to get the information from the community. Then we might make a presentation to the community and show them through the design, help them walk through that they understand it. That's part of our job. And then there'll be iterations going out to the community, coming back as we make changes, like I say in the center there, justify and refine it till it's accepted and approved. Then it goes out for implementation. And again, the local experts, the people there, are in charge of implementing it and then making any adaptations to it. It's also important to know that a lot of people don't speak English, which is absolutely fine. And so having an interpreter or somebody who can translate that into the local language is just as important. And that's on any design, especially for people, when you're working in your local area, countries of Europe, South America, right, different languages, just making sure that you have a good translation if you don't speak the language. And more than that, having a partner designer that does speak the language or is a local person is really important, because the concepts need to go across. The language needs to be straight and not have some confusion during the translation. By the way, all of these graphics are available on for the UD designers. This is another design in Mississippi, and lots of contour information on this. A lot going on with water, flooding, things like that. We have a large berm on the left to back the water up, following the contour lines, and in this case, showing them how we do have, 3 or 4 feet of water catchment during hurricanes and things like that, where we can catch the water on the property for infiltration and then let it slowly drain out to the left there. And because it was so hilly and it was a valley, it would be a fairly, I shouldn't say simple, but some basically straightforward engineering on the left with a very large berm, pipes for overflow, 3 different overflows, 2 with pipes, drainage, and then 1 for overland overflow on the bottom there if it gets really high. We never want to overtop the dam. You always need to have a circuit breaker, sort of overland surface area where the water can go over so you don't ruin the dam by having it over top. Buildings, trees, all these things in here. Again, no aerial picture because of the space that it is, and also with the people that we're working with. Mostly they can just see the elements that we have on there. Could we bring in an aerial picture? Absolutely. Screen it back 15 to 20%, get the texture, get the color, would not conflict with what we're trying to do at all in this. But then also using the extra space of the information at the top for plant lists, for the key, and then the soil maps on the right, as you can see, because the soil is changing all the way across there, and you can actually see where like the yellow is, where the valley is, and now then the soils change as they go uphill on the other side. Very steep terrain, not even touching that hill on the south because it's just so steep and growing. Other things we might do up there, but have to be very careful about it. Now you can see our colors are getting more muted as we're getting later in the years, giving easier reads on these things by thinning out and using more transparency, but also in the buildings and the structures, having those pop out better by not muting those at all. Roofs and things like that, any kind of hardscapes, usually are fairly solid because we want those to come out more. Now in this case, this is just the base map of an assessment for a property in Texas. This is a ranch, lots of cattle. And they hired me to go there. And by the way, this was from a workshop, or I should say a trade show that I was at in Texas. And I used to do a lot of trade shows, Acres, Mother Earth News, things like that. The Moses Conference, it's called something else now, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I would do a lot of those. They were great. I had a booth set up. I had my maps there. And in this case, in Texas, I just had a sheet that said, these are the prices. Here's what you get. And I sold 5 projects at that one place. And it was amazing. Some of those were like this, though, where they just wanted some advice and assessment. And they got one map for here. And there was no design work. There was nothing after this. It was basically not even 3 phases. It was just an assessment and then showing them what I was thinking about things they need to do. In this case, the land was highly compacted. I mean, the water runoff, and they had these huge ponds that were all silting in. The cattle were in the ponds. There was a lot of strategy and things that they were doing that needed to change. And my advice to them was about the swales and the berms, for collecting water and getting it in the ground, also for subsoiling to break up the soil and basically start rotating the pastures a little bit more on here. I'm not sure any of that happened as this actually got going. I didn't get a good response from them with the things that I was saying, and I don't really know what their expectations were, which might have been on me for that. But it really did need a lot of work in order to get the infiltration that they needed to drought-proof and summer-proof this landscape, because they did get a fair amount of rain there, but it was all just running off into those ponds, filling the ponds in. And then again, one of the things I learned with this too, and this is working with other designers, is animals don't go in the ponds. Water gets pumped out of the ponds if they want to feed them or water them into stock tanks. But having ramps, having animals go into the pond reduces their weight gain. They just poop and pee in the ponds, and it's not good for that, especially with nitrogen and things like that. So all of these things you kind of learn as you go. So the key up in the upper right was for the different areas, different suggestions of things being done in this area. And then you can also see a slight aerial picture and the contour lines in the background. Now, this was one of my favorite projects in Minnesota. I worked for this family twice. And so you can see the iterations of the designs. 80 acres, flew the drone, loved it, got some very, very good early spring imagery with that, stitched that together, got some very good resolution on there. And that's how I had this aerial picture. So these are the different stages. And when I do a really good aerial photo stitching job where it comes together, I usually give people a copy of that because people love to have that aerial picture, right? Even where I am today, I did the drone shot and I've already sent a 56 megabyte JPEG, a large file, but great detail for them so they can actually have something to look at when they're talking about their property. So in my case, on the left there, you can see the buildings, the roads, other things that are in there, which is what you see in the middle design, but the aerial picture is zoomed up to 100%. Or I should say the transparency is at 100%. If you look closely, you'll see all the ponds are still there. All the plants are still there. The numbers and things like that. The roads. It's just that I really brought out that aerial picture to give it a lot of punch. So they had a good aerial, how things are right now at that day anyway, were plants, and they have something to refer to. And then in the second design, where I screen back the aerial picture quite a bit, then this is my base map, highlighting the different kinds of plants, the plant communities, things like that, naming areas for reference of how we're going to treat the different woodlands, marsh areas, things like that. And then in the third one is the actual final design, where we found little pockets of areas where we could fence them off because they wanted to do a lot of foraging. They wanted to do a lot of production. So in the field, in this very pristine 80 acres of forest land, because it was so wet, because all the other farms around it for generations had been dumping their water into this area, it had a great canopy and had a great opportunity, and it had enough rise and fall where we had water flow, airflow, things like that, and then we would find these specific zones where we could grow certain plants, fruiting shrubs, things like that, relative to the soil, relative to the moisture, and then customizing the plant list to those areas. So this was a fun job to work on for that, because I got to work with polycultures a lot. You'll see a few of those on the far right one. Different lists, different plants in each one. And then they also had 3 different copies of this, from the aerial to the base map to the final design, to look at and for reference. So, and then again, you can see now coming into this how the colors are changing. This is in 2018. See how the muting of the colors are kind of thinning back, and then other things are coming forward. So that's really organizing our layers and the density of those layers so that it's easily read and it's organized in a way that people can understand it a little bit easier too. In North Dakota, this was a family farm. You can see this is the base map here, and then as we go through it, we'll see also that we have the final design underneath it there. And this is basically taking an existing windbreak that was there, using and adding to it. They did have the fruit On the lower right there, they had orchard and they had trees in there. We added a lot more, but they didn't really have any water collection. It wasn't really done very well. And this was a good example of somebody who had played with permaculture, understood permaculture, but they were working and they had 2 kids and a large family. They were building this house and other things. On the far right, there's a building to the right. That's the barn. It actually was like a barn dominium that they lived in for 3 years while they were building their house. And then just before I got there, added the garage. It has the big concrete apron in the front. But what I'll say about this one, first of all, you see the colors muted again. You'll see kind of almost like a 3D effect when we have the shadows on the buildings, how they're coming out, access. That's why I think the shadows and the roof lines are really important, because it gives it scale and it gives it, when you look at it, and I might even have put a car in the driveway, which is good because people can't relate to the scale and the size unless they have something familiar to look at. Of course, in this case, it is their house, it is their barn, and so they can kind of tell. But even to put a little tractor or to put a little car in the driveway immediately gives the brain a sense of scale. What was interesting about this site too is you see the blue tanks on the back of the house, a greenhouse, and then also the fact that there's a lot of gray water distribution coming from the barn itself and from the house. The orchard on the far right was watered by runoff coming from the barn roof, of course, going out with gray water that was coming from the house. So during the dry summer, the washer and the showers were all tied to gray water going through a biofilter and then filtering out into the orchard space. So they had a lot of irrigation possibilities and options with that gray water coming out of the house. The far left curve to the left of the house, that was a large hill. They had excavated to flatten out the land because it was on a hill. So we built that up and burned that up even higher so that they had a windbreak. The prevailing winds come from the northwest. It is North Dakota. It is cold, minus 30s, minus 20 Fahrenheit, with 40-mile-an-hour winds in the wintertime. And so that was basically a way to have a windbreak for them. And it's a big snow fence, too. So it's going to collect the snow so it doesn't drift over the rest of the farm in the wintertime. But also, you can see that big windbreak that their uncle had planted around that property. A lot of those trees were suffering, too. A lot of them were dead. And then you'll see some other plants in there, the large circles. And those are replacement plants to kind of fill in the gaps. And generally speaking, over time, the idea was to kind of start getting more diversity in that windbreak around it and add more plants, more production, and really just more habitat, too, for the local wildlife. Oh, yeah, there's a close-up of the house. And you can see the polycultures going in. You can also see the fact that we're starting to use the initials for the scientific name. Hoop house behind it, water tanks for storage off the roof. They did get a fair amount of water. And in this case, basically, the wife, the partner, she had the front yard. She wanted it a certain way. So you can see all the plants just packed into that front planting area by the front door. And then there was a brick wall to kind of level off the turf from the front of the house because it was a hill. And then a second wall or berm area. So they basically had 2 terraces coming off the house for turf. And that was about it for the grass. It was so dry there and the soil wasn't conducive to that. But at least in the entrance area to the house, they had that. They had a concrete pad on the back of the house, which is nice, and sliding doors. And so we just added a pergola to that to give them some shade on the north side. A more recent project from 2021, working in Iraq at a refugee camp. And this worked out, really well. Working with the different designers. Kayla, who was the project manager, it was the client. Ryan Copeland from Texas, myself and Warushka worked on this. And Kelly Bull. And was a really fun project to work on. Of course, it was fraught with all sorts of unknowns. I know Ryan took 2 trips there, one for design and one for installation, which you can see in the far right, upper right picture there. But in this case, getting a good aerial, we could find. Then we did our base map of what the existing space was, and then doing our final design work on this. And then we have the call-outs, how the different areas, that one little orchard area, we called it the Orchard Oasis in the upper left there. That was the tiny little space just south of the building. And then in the upper right corner with the northeast field and northwest fields, that was actually the entrance, where there was a lot of zaya pits, pits cut for trees and things like that to collect water. There are a lot of issues with this space and a lot of lessons learned from being here, because they have really harsh winters with a lot of water, and a lot of those ponds just froze over with the trees in them. So there were a lot of issues that we learned over time, also during installation, a lot of things that might have been done once we learned that. But we had an issue with machinery, expertise, budgeting, all those kinds of things to get this done well. But it was a really great design in how it was established, following the existing patterns that were there and trying to enhance their production and increase the carrying capacity of the land. Oh, there we go. So I forgot there was another slide in here. So now you can see the existing polycultures in the trees and the berms and water collection area in the upper right corner. A lot of perennial and tree plants in row cropping. So there are areas where the animals are going to be growing animals in pasture, things like that. And then in between would be the fruit trees and things, almost like a silver pasture. So those areas in between could be garden space. It could be an area for animals. And then we had a lot of water collection areas all around the property, hoping to collect whatever fell there and store it and at least get it in the ground. What I like about this is, again, great artwork that was done here, showing the profiles of how the slope is, what plants are going in these different areas. Nice plant lists on here. We have, of course, good artists in the group that can do these things. Warushka, I think, did these. And then building the concept for people to understand how this is going to look on a profile as opposed to just straight down. But you can see now, good muted colors, good building colors, all the kinds of things, little easier to see. And even having those, it's funny, those little carts, the little trucks there on the far right, just gives you an idea of scale. And I think, again, that's important to have, is something familiar, because after a while, you can't really tell how big is that building, how big is that hoop house. You don't know, but you throw a truck in there or a tractor, anything like that that's familiar, and all of a sudden your brain gives it the scale that you can work with. Oh, and this is another, the artwork put in here by Varushka, kind of showing the interplanting of the areas, the spacing of the areas, and what's planted in between that. Wind is a good reason for that. Beneficial insects, of course, another good reason for that. It's dry, it's windy, and now we can have these windbreaks here to collect the water and cool the air. Well, thank you.